Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to our campaign series on Sherman's March to the Sea, which was conducted at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah, Georgia in February of 1996. We had 7 presenters on this program, and unfortunately, 3 of them, perhaps 4 of them, have already gone to their reward. The first speaker we have in this program is Nat Hughes, and he has passed away in the last few years. Nat is and was a fascinating Southern gentleman. You will get it from his brogue. He was from Tennessee, and he has a lot of connections. He was tied to buildings. The Nathaniel Cheers house is tied to his family as part of the 1864 Tennessee campaign around Spring Hill. As you look at Nat Hughes, is to realize that not only is he a Civil War buff, he has lived the Civil War, and his ancestry is within the Civil War. Despite that, he is also a first-rate historian. He didn't write books that were really deeply detailed. That was not Nat's style. Instead, what Nat did was he went after a topic, and then he got to the essence of it pretty quickly, wrote in a style that was clearly not an academic historian style, but nonetheless was engaging. I read all of his books early on, so I have to be honest, it's been probably 20 years since I've read one of Nat's books, and they were plentiful. In this case, what attracted me to him on this was the Confederate defense against Sherman's march, and that was the responsibility of primarily around Savannah of William Hardee. And Nat had written a biography of Hardee, Old Reliable. And Hardee is a fascinating man. A gentleman who had been within the Western armies, the Army of Tennessee, for some period of time, had indeed he had acquainted well with the other commanders of the Army. I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, to read Thomas Conley's series on the Army of Tennessee is to find that Hardee may have been one of that group of commanders who squandered the talents in the blood of the Army of Tennessee, as Conley was wont to do. I mean, Conley found grief with Robert E. Lee, wrote The Marble Man. So I'm not sure necessarily if all the assessments of all the Army of Tennessee commanders, including Hardee, were entirely accurate. But Hardee, who had been the commander of West Point, had also, or had been commandant of West Point, and had also written an infantry manual still easily acquired today, known as Hardee's Tactics, was highly respected in the old Army and was a prize when he came south. He was, as I mentioned, he had been the commandant of the West Point, but never been the superintendent. And I don't know, as a officer who had not had stars on his shoulders at any point, I'm not sure that he was ever completely comfortable with the fact that he did have stars and was now accepting command responsibilities. As it was, Hardee had never commanded one of the major armies. He was, however, offered the command of a major army after Bragg was fired, and he refused it. He refused the promotion and refused to take command of the army. And I don't think Jefferson Davis ever forgot that. Regardless of what you may think about Hardee, the fact is that he was offered the mantle at a time when his country needed him, and he wasn't there. And so I think that he probably was on thin ice, as many of the rebellious Western commanders were. And when he becomes a part of the Army of Tennessee's structure under Joe Johnston, because he has refused that when Davis makes the decision that Johnson has to be removed before Atlanta falls, Hardee is not considered for the command of the Army, and the command goes to the young John Bell Hood, which is a distinct slap in the face at Hardee, as well as I think Davis intended. You turned him down once, he certainly wasn't going to turn to you again. And so Hardee, refusing to serve under Hood, is reassigned to the west, and then ultimately is reassigned back to the South Atlantic coast area, the Charleston, Savannah area. And so when Sherman makes the decision to change his base of supplies and make Georgia howl by making a march, the person who is going to be charged with stopping him is William Hardee. I think that, again, not remembering specifically what Nat talks about in this, but I did ask him to focus on Hardee. I think that you'll get a fine portrayal of Hardee as a military commander, and indeed then talk about his decisions ultimately to evacuate both Charleston, or not Charleston, but Savannah, and perhaps Charleston as well if he takes a little further. But very interesting talk to start with, the commander of Savannah, William Hardee. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy Nat Hughes and his talk about William Hardee. Hood, Cheatham, and Claiborne eating breakfast in her house before they went to that disastrous rendezvous at Franklin. At the same time, Mrs. Cheer's husband was in prison in Camp Chase, Ohio. So certainly Dr. Hughes has a deep, abiding, and personal interest in the Civil War that goes back many, many years. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Nat Hughes and his wife, Buffy.
I'll tend to wander a little, and if you have trouble hearing me, just let me know. Tennessee and Georgia don't get along all that well. Perhaps the most famous locomotive during the Civil War was the General, which was part of the Andrews Raiders chase. And we had it very proudly in Chattanooga. But in the dark of the night, damn Georgians came up there and stole the General from Chattanooga, right in the middle of our town and out, and we were powerless. We were victimized. It was a terrible, terrible situation. We were victimized again last year. Georgia's always victimized in Tennessee. They went to Knoxville and took this young, magnificent executive director of the East Tennessee Historical Society, Todd Gross, and stole him, brought him down here to Savannah to head up the Georgia Historical. And I'm very proud for Todd, and that's wonderful, but Tennessee lost a lot. I'd like to ask you to do one thing, though, regarding Todd Gross, since you've seen him, you met him this morning. The Lafayette McLaw's papers are upstairs. A historian in Fredericksburg, a magnificent historian in my opinion, Bob Crick, was undertaking a biography of Lafayette McLaw's, and he let it drop. And I don't dare twist Todd's arm to undertake that biography, but you might help me do it. McLaw's needs a good, solid biographer. I think Todd fills all those qualities. So help me twist Todd's arm, would you, and encourage him to undertake that biography of Lafayette McLaw's. I think that's an opportunity for him and for us and for Civil War scholarship. If you look in your sheets, I think there's a little bit of an outline of mine, which is about as brief as an outline could be. So I'm going to talk about four guys. And war, the Civil War doesn't mean anything to me unless I talk about people, and particularly individuals. That's what led me into it, and that's what I'd like to talk about this morning. I've done some biography. I'm fascinated by biography. I've done some battles too, but biography I'm really more interested in. I've done a biography of a Boy Scout. I've done a biography of a fool. I've done a biography of a drunk. And it's real pleasing to me to be able to talk about my Boy Scout. And with that, that's William J. Hardee, a person that is a dear friend of mine and I've known a long time. And I think I know pretty well. However, let me say something for all biographers to undercut us in a way. We have to recreate a life based on a couple of handfuls, maybe an armful of letters, maybe a diary, not in Hardee's case, official documents, what other people say about a person. And then you have to have the audacity to come up and say, hey, I'm going to recreate this historical figure for you. That can't be done, and all of us ought to be a little bit humble when we say we've done that. I wrote Hardee, I did the research in the 50s and wrote my biography in the 50s. And I'm a lot older now, and my perspective has changed. 40 years ago, when I began working with Hardee, I admired certain of his personal qualities, and I still do, but today I see him differently. I still admire his charm and his easy way with people, but I appreciate more his ability to bind men and women to him. In an era of strutting and posturing and self-puffing, I think he was unusual in his diffidence and his modesty. Not that he did not know how to use military pomp and showmanship for effect. Hardee was a master of that type of role-playing. But he had an overarching sense of duty and propriety. He had integrity. He could be trusted. He kept his commitments, and he was honest, even at personal cost. He was a consummate professional soldier, a model for his West Point cadets and for the officers and men who served under him. And Hardee expected nothing less from his subordinates. I do not believe Hardee had an ounce of duplicity in him. Now, some well-qualified historians would disagree very strongly with that assessment. Yet, in my opinion, he would not indulge in finger-pointing and excuse-making and undercutting. This quality he shares with a man we'll talk about a little bit later this morning, Henry Slocum. Hardee possessed a high degree of self-assurance in a personal way, and perhaps in the most important way. His confidence, his self-awareness as a military man, on the other hand, was different. He had no illusions about himself, and saw himself, I would suggest, as an able subordinate rather than as a compelling leader. I don't think he considered himself Braxton Bragg's superior, or for that matter, his equal in military matters. But Hardee knew, at least by the spring of 1863, that Bragg could not lead successfully the Army of Tennessee. And he let Bragg know how he felt. Imagine what that must have meant to Braxton Bragg. A man so gnawed within by paranoia that he tended to put his confidence in Gideon Pillows and W.H.T. Walkers. I don't know if those names mean anything to you, but those extremely controversial men in the Civil War era because of their personal qualities. He put his trust in men like that rather than the Leonidas Polks and the William J. Hardees. We must note, however, that Bragg and Hardee, their differences notwithstanding, maintained until the end of the war a courteous, professional relationship. It was Bragg that asked for Hardee to come back after Chickamauga. Stay with me and help me flank here. Missionary Ridge. I need you. It was to Bragg Hardee turned after the calamity. And there are several calamities about Atlanta, but the calamity of Joseph E. Johnston being replaced. It was an intolerable situation for Hardee. And the person he turned to, which says a lot about their relationship, it was a very touchy relationship, but it was professional. He turned to Bragg to help him. Anything to get me out of the situation. Hardee believed in Joseph E. Johnston. although he would disagree with Johnston at times. He also believed in Albert Sidney Johnston and served him very closely, although he objected to some of Albert Sidney Johnston's decisions. And he believed in Beauregard, I would suggest, and I'm not very confident about this assertion, but I believe he had confidence in Pierre G.T. Beauregard. Hardee could not have commanded, in my opinion, a Gideon Pillow. I don't think. I don't believe he could have commanded a Bedford Forrest. Yet, to argue against myself, he did know how to handle the extremely difficult St. John or Liddell. And as you've seen and will see in this campaign, he got pretty good service out of a G.W. Smith, Major General G.W. Smith, who could be about as cantankerous as the best of them. Hardee paid close attention to detail, and according to one account, he was the only Confederate lieutenant general who personally inspected the arms and equipment of every soldier in his corps. He inspired confidence in the ranks. His troops seemed to know what to expect from him, and they trusted him. In fact, there was a famous outfit in the Army of Tennessee called the Orphan Brigade, a bunch of Kentuckian magnificent soldiers. And right after Atlanta, they decided to take these infantrymen and they put them on horses. Of course, they never got them all mounted, but they tried to put them on horses, and they served under Joe Wheeler as cavalry. Well, as Sherman closed in on Savannah, Hardee looked at this, catch-all group of soldiers he had to defend this city, and he knew he'd got to get some infantry he could rely on. So he had the orphans dismounted and put them in the trenches. And one of them, a guy who's written kind of a Civil War classic named Johnny Green of the Orphan Brigade, said, "Gee, it's nice to be back under Hardee. We don't mind defending Savannah as long as we got him leading us." Hardee, remember, was a professional, consistently so. It might make him, or made him appear somewhat detached or lacking in passion or earnestness at times. And to use a tennis expression, I once heard Tony Traver when he was talking about McEnroe, but something that stuck with me. He said, McEnroe always plays within himself. And I think Hardee always played within himself. I could never picture Hardee kicking one of his men, physically disciplining them. He was always in character. Reminds me of Alan Tate's Major Louis Buchan in The Father. It's a wonderful little novel that he wrote. Hardee lived by a strict code of conduct, ethics. It was the cult of the gentleman, and he believed in it with all his heart. A regulated, ordered, temperate life with emphasis upon the proprieties. He was fashionable to the point of being called a dandy. His manners were impeccable. And I had the privilege, came by way of a newspaper ad. I just trying to find out things, but I had the privilege of meeting his granddaughter. And oh gosh, she was dying to tell, my wife Bucky was here with me. We spent 2 glorious days with her, most of them upstairs, and she had a bedridden daughter, most of the time sitting up there so that daughter could hear everything. In fact, in the living room, here was a portrait, a full length, 6 feet. That portrait, nobody had ever seen that portrait. There it was in this lady's living room. And I wished I'd had it, and finally LSU reprinted that thing in paperback. I said, one condition, put that portrait, nobody's ever seen a portrait, put that portrait out there. But she was telling tales and showing me clippings of hair and all these intimate family things that went way back. And Hardee's papers don't exist. They were burned half a dozen times. And then his sister-in-law, he had 2 wives. His first wife died young, he had 4 kids. His sister-in-law that kind of took care of the family was with him at West Point. I think those 2 were in love. They never married, though, and I know they corresponded frequently, but I think she destroyed all their correspondence, which I'm very sorry for historically. It would have been wonderful. But the granddaughter, and I'm wandering around right now, the granddaughter told me stories about her mother and the other girls and how Hardee would not even let them out of the house unless they had gloves on. This was his wife. Unless they had gloves on, unless you're properly attired, unless you behave correctly at all times, never step out of character. And she said the one thing that goes against that in the family tradition was that the one time Hardee would really let himself down, he loved to garden. And he'd get out there in that garden, and she said he seemed to delight in taking the most disreputable looking clothes in the world, going out in that garden, and there he would really be himself, I think, and totally relaxed. He was a good-humored, marvelous dinner party guest, and everyone, every soldier wished to be invited to Hardee's mess. This is a man who on the side would dine at the White House. He was well connected all the way from New York down below Savannah. You consider St. Augustine his second home, and this place his second home. A lovely, wonderful human being. Created some great friendships and very few enemies. One of his greatest friends was Jefferson Davis, which turned out to be a terrible, strange situation after Atlanta. He sat by Davis's bedside when Davis was Secretary of War, and Davis, most people don't remember about Jefferson. Jefferson Davis was sick, badly sick. He'd lost one eye. Suffered under all kinds of physical disabilities, and he had personal tragedy that stalked him during the war. Hardee sat by his bedside for an hour and tried to nurse him. He loved Davis. And Davis turned to him when they created the bill, the Army bill, to create the Confederate Army. Hardee, the 1st Regiment of the Confederate Army, Hardee would take charge of it. And where did he send him when the war was ready to start? Way out in the wilds of Arkansas. Deal with that governor of Arkansas, and somehow let's bring Arkansas into the Confederacy, and let's get some of those rough, wild people out there in Arkansas organized. And if you know anything about the Army of Tennessee, the one outfit, the best soldiers they had in that army were his Arkansas troops. And none of them, I don't recall a single professional soldier that was out there except Hardee training these people. He was very comfortable in the presence of women. He loved to tease them in an overly complimentary way, using mock seriousness. And I went to school on this. I was a headmaster of girls' schools for 20-something years with thousands of them. I read Hardee. He was my textbook on how you write a girl, how you address them. He knew how to do that. He was marvelous. And he had female friendships that endured. And in this respect, I think he's very much like Robert E. Lee. Lee was this way, although a tremendous difference, many differences in the two men, but a very basic difference. He didn't have this burning desire within him to redeem the family name that drove Lee. Hardee had his own ghosts, though. He was captured, and remember the opening of the Mexican War, President Polk saying, "American blood's been shed on American soil." Well, that's true or not, beside the point. But the American soil he was talking about, just across the Rio Grande, a little place called La Rosia, and there they captured 2 companies of American dragoons. Hardee was one of them. Blundered right in, he was not the commander, but he was the second in command. Blundered right into that trap, and they were captured. And he was released, 6 weeks afterwards, but he never forgot that. It blighted his career. He's kind of always wanted to work past that for some reason. Good form, important to Hardee. Restraint, important to Hardee. And the only 2 times I can recall that Hardee apparently lost his composure, stepped out of character. One was in the flank attack against McPherson on July 22nd at Atlanta, when W.H.T. Walker, the other Georgian, sought permission from his friend or associate, I don't know if they were friends, but associate Hardee, to circumvent. There was a pond out there that was messy, and Walker wanted to get around it. It was a terrible delay, and Hardee refused, said, "Do not do it. We've lost too much time anyway. Move on." Made Walker furious. And it's recorded that Walker said, "That man will answer to me for this." And Walker's a very brave man, but God, what a temper. And by answer to me for this after this battle, he meant what he said. The second time was following the Battle of Bentonville, which is in March 1865. The war's over, practically. So early in April, and Hardee saw a copy of John Bell Hood's report of Atlanta. It made him furious. He wrote Hood directly a hard, stinging letter full of rebuke, and a most uncharacteristic letter. He saw himself as a teacher, and I propose that Hardee was outstanding in this respect, not only with privates, but with company and field grade officers, and of course with certain general officers. Patrick Cleburne, whom Hardee loved, did not burst forth in the summer of 1861 as the Pat Cleburne the Confederacy came to know. I would submit that the Army of Tennessee, which lacked the cadre of West Point and VMI officers that the Army of Northern Virginia enjoyed, would have been considerably less effective as an army without his presence. And let me share now with you 4 scenes. You can kind of pick them up for whatever they're worth. That might make Hardee a little more real and understandable. The first is on a train near Hillsborough, North Carolina, in April 1865. Bentonville's been fought, no more battles, the Army's being Lee surrendered, Lincoln's been killed, everything's falling apart. They are on board that train car is Hardee and a group of Union officers. He had one staff officer with him. They're drinking and they're chatting in friendly fashion with these, his enemies, his mortal enemies. Actually, they're all part of the old Army fraternity. These were old friends from the old Army. John Schofield, Jacob Cox, and several others on board this train. But think of it a little bit from Hardee's perspective. He's role-playing here. His nation had been destroyed. His only son, his boy Willie, had just been killed at Bentonville. 2 weeks before, just been killed at the hands of these men with whom he was socializing. Union Commander Jacob Cox recorded his impressions of the train ride and of Hardee. The time ran rapidly away. Hardee was in person and bearing a good type of the brilliant soldier and gentleman. Tall and well-formed, his uniform well-fitting and almost dandyish, his manner genial and easy, his conversation at once gay and intelligent. It would be hard to find a more attractive companion, or one with whom you would like to spend, or you would be put more quickly at ease. Then a little later, Hardee got married right in the middle of the war. He married a woman in her 20s, half his age. He was 49 when the war was over. Married Forward Lewis. This occurs 3 days after one of his dearest friends, Leonidas Pope, had been killed, and Hardee watched him be killed. It's the flippant letter to figure out why. I thought the death of our dear old friend General Pope would cause you to feel uneasy about my safety, he wrote his wife. According to the doctrine of chances, I am in less danger now than before. There being but 3 lieutenant generals and 1 being killed, the chances for the safety of others are greatly increased. The Josiah Dorcas diary. This is in August 1865. After the war, Hardee's down on a plantation out in the middle of nowhere, struggling, trying to be a farmer. Hardee's a farmer. What's the word in the contradiction in terms? I mean, Hardee's a farmer, just doesn't work. Yeah, thank you. Wednesday, August 9th. The morning was excessively hot. Went on to General Hardee's and dined there. Met Miss Amelia Lightfoot and Miss Sue Tarleton there. The first is very agreeable and well instructed. The other was engaged to General Cleburne and wears mourning for him. What's she doing at Hardee's home? She's in Mobile. What's she doing at Hardee's home? Way up in Alabama. Wearing mourning for Hardee's dear friend. Saturday, went with General Hardee to see Longstreet and dined there. General Hardee is not pleased with Longstreet, thinks him somewhat self-sufficient and engrossed with himself. I was surprised to hear how little credit Longstreet was inclined to give General Lee. The credit for suggesting the movement against McClellan he gives to General Johnston, that against Pope to Jackson. Then back to the train ride once again in North Carolina. This is General Cox, the Union general, recording this. He asks Hardee generally about the war. Hardee replies, I confess that I was one of those hot Southerners who shared the notion that one man of the South could whip 3 Yankees. But the first year of the war pretty effectually knocked that nonsense out of us. And to tell the truth, ever since that time, we military men have generally seen There was only a question of how long it would take to wear out our army and destroy it. We have seen that there was no real hope of success except by some extraordinary accident of fortune. And we have also seen that the politicians would never give up until the army was gone. So we have fought with the knowledge that we were to be sacrificed with the result we see today. And none of us could tell who would live to see it. Please listen to this next sentence. We have continued to do our best, however, and have meant to fight as if we were sure of success. And that's here in Savannah in 1864. This is the Carolina campaign against Sherman. Let me leave Hardee with the name that the men of the Army of Tennessee called him. They called him Old Reliable. That was their judgment, and that's good enough for me. Here, a couple things to keep in mind. No, I'm not going to talk next time. Let me switch down another name. You've got to really switch gears. Hardee's cadet. Little Joe, Fighting Joe, the war child, Joe Wheeler. Perhaps the most controversial of all Confederate cavalry commanders. Controversial within and without the Confederate Army, and controversial ever since. Tom Conley, wonderful historian, he's now dead, dismissed Wheeler as an overrated bantam cock, an unexceptional West Pointer who possessed a suavity, a love of drill, and a vocabulary that outshone the rough-hewn forest. And a problem whenever you're talking about Joe Wheeler, to understand Joe Wheeler, to think about Joe Wheeler, it's right back. All around him is his figure of Nathan Bedford Forrest. You can't see Wheeler by himself. You've got Forrest always here, over his shoulder. You can't. It inhibits anything done with Wheeler. Wheeler, says Conley, got his opportunities because he knew how to manipulate Braxton Bragg, to whom he demonstrated devout loyalty. Besides, he had a facile pen that could turn small, unimportant cavalry strikes into massive raids. Stanley Bourne, on the other hand, admired little Joe Wheeler's bravery, and he was a brave man. Gosh, he never asked a soldier to do what he didn't do. He admired the rigorous training routine that he took the Confederate cavalry of the Army of Tennessee and put them through at Dalton in the winter, early spring of 1864. He admired his splendid defense of the Army as it retreated out of Kentucky, and his good work with Joseph E. Johnston during the Atlanta campaign. Captain Alonzo Gray, author of Cavalry Tactics as Illustrated in the War of the Rebellion, which was written in 1910, felt, now this is different now, felt, Wheeler, I'm quoting, Wheeler was, without doubt, the ablest Confederate cavalry leader in the West. He was always ready to work in the team and play a subordinate part to his commanding general. Forrest, according to Gray, was a very able man, but served best when operating alone. Morgan, John Hunt Morgan, was a raider, not able to work in conjunction with other troops. Perhaps the most balanced assessment of Wheeler comes from his biographer, John B. Dyer. This is written in 1941. You know how you got to update everything every 10 or 20 years. 41. And I went back and reread Dyer before I came here. I'm impressed with this biography because he tries real hard to be objective. However, there's a need for a Wheeler, at least a Wheeler Civil War study, because this is a 400-page book, and one half of it, or less than half of it, deals with the Civil War. The rest of it, Wheeler did many things in life. This is John B. Dyer talking. Fighting Joe was, in most respects, not much more than an average officer. His meteoric rise seems due not so much to brilliance or as to his ability to take an order and then stay on the job night and day until it was executed. He always lacked much of the dash and audacity of Morgan and Forrest, but in the matter of subordinating himself and of playing the part assigned him in a campaign, he probably excelled them both. That's pretty strong and I think balanced. Wheeler did work well with his superiors, Dyer contends. There seems to have been no part of him that cried out for the wild excitement of the raid, although when one became necessary, he performed his duty well. Joe Johnston and Hardee understood Wheeler. Remember, who was the cavalry commander among the upper echelon in the Army of Tennessee? It was Hardee. His whole career in the old Army was spent cavalry. 2nd Cavalry, 2nd Dragoons. They understood Wheeler best and used him to the greatest advantage. During the Atlanta campaign, Johnston kept Wheeler close to him, doing the job for which he was best equipped, covering the flanks, covering retirements, obtaining information and protecting communications. And just after Johnston left the Army, in the closing stages of the Atlanta campaign, Wheeler won, according to the historian Al Castell, one of the biggest cavalry victories of the war in his repulse of the Stoneman-McCook raid against Hood's communications. Wheeler also performed well in short, clearly defined raids. He wrecked Alexander McCook's wagon train and destroyed about everything in the rear of the Union Army on the eve of the Battle of Murfreesboro. And he almost ran Rosecrans out of Chattanooga with his Sequatchie Valley raid in late September 1863. But Alonzo Gray is right. Joe Wheeler was no raider. He and Forrest turned a near success into a near disaster in their Fort Donelson raid of 1863. Then 9 months later, when he extended his Sequatchie Valley raid, Wheeler transformed a great success into an embarrassing fiasco as Federal cavalry united against him in Middle Tennessee. His August 1864 raid against Sherman's communications degenerated into a running fight for hundreds of miles and resulted in wrecking the cavalry of the Army of Tennessee. In this raid, he lost 3 of his 4 general officers, including his 2 most reliable, John H. Kelly and Will Martin, and he lost half, some people say as many as 4,000 of the 4,500 men he took with him. Wrecked the Confederate cavalry then. Upon his return from Tennessee, Wheeler was given the assignment by Hood to oppose Sherman with the survivors of his disastrous East Tennessee campaign. This should be kept in mind, I think, when discussing his performance in the Savannah campaign. Hood, on October the 22nd, gave Wheeler the following orders containing the broadest type of responsibility. I'm quoting Hood. You must endeavor to keep the Dalton and Atlanta Railroad constantly cut, he wrote, and should the enemy evacuate Atlanta, you must destroy all the road north of the Chattahoochee and constantly concentrating toward your left. Be prepared to join at any time the main body of my army, the Army of Tennessee, which is moving off into Alabama. Should the enemy advance anywhere, you will drive off all the stock in their front and destroy all the mills within 10 miles of their line of march, retarding them as much as possible. And here I agree with John B. Dyer. Perhaps no soldier ever received a harder assignment. Wheeler with 4,500 men. His mission to destroy the railroad from Atlanta northward and at the same time be prepared to follow Sherman and fight him. Hood's order later was expanded by Braxton Bragg on December 1. Supplies of all kinds useful to the enemy and not required for your use must be destroyed. Thus Wheeler, says Dyer, was ordered to take an undisciplined, disorganized group of hungry cavalrymen and go into a portion of the country to destroy anything which might be of use to the enemy. Add to this the pernicious practice of the Confederate government that every cavalryman must furnish his own mount, thereby unwittingly encouraging horse stealing. You know the result. Georgia would howl, not only from the depredation of Sherman's foragers, but from Wheeler's roaming Confederate cavalrymen. Colonel Alfred Roman, Beauregard's trusted chief of staff, went to inspect the situation. There were so many complaints about Wheeler and his cavalrymen, and I think his report is pretty effective. No one admires General Wheeler more than I do. He is a modest, conscientious, industrious officer. He takes a fatherly interest in his command. His activity is proverbial and is equaled only by his gallantry. But he is wanting in firmness. His mind and his will are not in proper relation to one another. He is too gentle, too lenient, and we know how easily leniency can be made to degenerate into weakness. General Wheeler's men like him, but do not appear to be proud of him. They know he will always fight well, but seem to feel that he cannot make them fight So, Roman recommended drastic action. Had I the power, he wrote, I would relieve General Wheeler from his command, not as a rebuke, not as a punishment, for he surely deserves neither, but on higher grounds, that is to say, for the good of the cause and for his own reputation. Wheeler would not be replaced, however, and although he would render reasonably good service in the Carolinas, he would be replaced as chief of Joe Johnston's cavalry by Wade Hampton, and would end the war with a badly tarnished reputation. The big bad wolf. And I'm determined not to get to John's talk. But I want to throw out a couple of mine. I don't get to talk about Sherman. In my opinion, he is the most outstanding general officer of the Civil War. Sherman knew how to marshal resources and accomplish his mission, often achieving more than anyone expected. He did this while winning the absolute confidence of his troops. And that for me is a big statement. And to be a little more daring, I would venture to say that Sherman's army that marched to Savannah, and certainly the one that moved north up through the Carolinas, was the finest army put together in the Civil War. I marvel at what Sherman did in 6 short months. His continuous, unrelenting expedition of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah to Goldsboro to Raleigh, an amazing feat. The unpleasant wolf, Henry Warner Slocum. I never paid much attention to Henry Slocum until I began to work on Bentonville. Probably because he was identified in the Army of the Potomac for so much of the war. Then when he came to the West, he didn't fight against the Army of Tennessee throughout the Atlanta campaign. It was really only in the Battle of Bentonville. Indeed, Ezra Warner, whose work Generals in Blue I greatly admire, gives Slocum's service under Sherman one sentence. Slocum is worth our notice, I believe. When McPherson got killed and Joe Hooker resigned in a huff, Sherman sent for Slocum explaining it this way: the other men I could have chosen did not possess the moral qualities that I wanted, not those adequate to the command. So Sherman chose old Slocum. The moral qualities I want. You don't think of this usually when talking about Sherman. Strange words to him. Did Kilpatrick have the moral qualities Sherman had? It's an interesting aspect of Sherman, however. Contradictions never seem to bother him very much. The best thing that's been written on Henry Slocum is Slocum crying for biography, crying out for biography. I would suggest is an essay by his friend Oliver O. Howard. This is the same fellow officer Slocum reputedly failed to help at the time at Gettysburg. Slocum and Howard had known each other at West Point. Slocum was older than most of the cadets, entering in 1848 when he was 21. What had he been doing before he was 21? Before he was 16 years old, in his late 15, he took charge of a country school. And from 15 to 21, he wasn't a school teacher. He ran a country school. That's what he did before he went to West Point. And by means of this experience, says Howard, he made habit, I love that verb, made habit of the qualities of self-control, just dealing, constant patience, and unquestioned example. Howard roomed on the floor just below him. I was 3 years his junior, he reported, but Henry Slocum treated me with kindness and attention. His individuality especially impressed itself upon me. He expressed himself openly when it cost much to do so as an opponent of human slavery. Another grateful cadet was Slocum's roommate, Phil Sheridan. Good fortune gave me for a roommate, said Sheridan, speaking of Slocum, a cadet whose studious habits and willingness to aid others benefited me immensely. Sheridan really says Slocum got me through West Point. Slocum became an artillery officer after he was commissioned, but the work bored him. And while he was stationed near here at Fort Moultrie there, Charleston, he read law under a local judge. He resigned from the Army in 1857 and returned to Syracuse, New York, where he became county treasurer, then a state legislator. Politically, however, Slocum was a maverick. Before the war, as Howard says, when he was unpopular, he was a Republican. And during the war, when it was easy to be a Republican, he was politically nothing. I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a soldier. Howard tells us that at the close of the war, when promotion waited on Republican soldiers, Slocum coolly became a Democrat. Can you imagine? I don't know if you know, can you imagine a Union general officer with placed like Slocum was, one of the senior commanders in the American Army, deciding at the end of the war, Republican, he had the best Republican traditions, he became a Democrat. He could have had the Republican nomination for Secretary of State, says Howard, but elected to become a Democrat for causes that took political pacification and not personal success into account. He could have been governor of New York twice if he'd been willing to stoop in the mud. Howard believed Sherman always acted from principle, and he had moral courage. That's why Howard admired him and made him his friend. But there was something independent, even perverse, about Henry Slocum. He wore only a mustache in an army that decreed whiskers, and this is a little bit of a signal. A lot of people didn't like Henry Slocum. When war came in 1861, he jumped in, became colonel of 27 New York, leading into Bull Run, where he received a nasty leg wound. He was a determined patriot, however, and as quickly as he could, he returned to action, earning promotion to brigade, then division command. He fought on the peninsula in the 7 days, and in the process became the next to youngest major general in the Union Army. At Second Bull Run, he was instrumental in averting complete disaster. At South Mountain, that September of 1862, his gallantry brought him still more into the public notice. Slocum fought well at Antietam and earned corps command, the youngest in that army, by the way. He did pretty well at Chancellorsville, although he ended up in an irreconcilable row with Army Commander Joe Hooker. He played an important and crucial role at Gettysburg, where his actions and his judgment at Cemetery Hill on July 2nd and 3rd prevented Meade's losing the Battle of Gettysburg, according to one commentator. Following Gettysburg, however, Slocum went west with Howard to counterbalance Longstreet's transfer. When he learned that he must serve under Hooker again, here's this man that had done fabulous things in the war. He resigned. I resent it. Sent him to Lincoln. And the beauty of that man, the way he knew how to handle situations, Lincoln pocketed it. And more than that, he sent a telegram out to Rosecrans, who was commanding the Union Army in the West, ordering him to separate those two guys. And Slocum ended up commanding the district of Vicksburg. When McPherson gets killed and they have that brouhaha in the Union Army command structure at Atlanta, Sherman sent for him. Come to Atlanta. I want you to take command of a corps. And he did. And when Sherman starts this way, he puts Slocum not as a corps commander. He puts him as a wing commander, giving him 2 corps and the 2 in his left wing, which he styled the Army of Georgia, and the rest you know. General William Cogswell, a brigade commander from Massachusetts who performed splendidly at Bentonville, maintained that Slocum was a well-chosen leader, brave and cool, faithful and impartial. And Philip Sherman, who's done recently a study of the engineering magic of Sherman's army, noted Slocum's innovativeness and adaptability, crediting him, among other things, with the process of creating these Sherman neckties, what they did with the railroad irons, coming this way. Many people did not like him, however, particularly Easterners, more particularly those loyal to Oliver O. Howard, who thought Slocum had failed their commander at Gettysburg. Thomas W. Osborne, Howard's chief of artillery, stated, "I have always since Gettysburg had a strong prejudice against Slocum. His peculiarities are unpleasant, and one is not apt to reform his prejudices in favor of an unpleasant man." George W. Nichols of Sherman's staff commented that Slocum enjoys the reputation of a thoroughly accomplished soldier, complete mastery of all details of his profession, possessing a keen sense of order and discipline. He had an energetic, magnetic manner. Yet his pride in being a New Yorker, his stiff neck, rubbed Nichols the wrong way as it did others. His personal appearance is prepossessing: long, wavy brown hair, brushed back behind his ears, sparkling brown eyes, a heavy brown mustache, as a mustache again, a height above the medium, and a manner which inspires faith and confidence. He seems to know precisely what he has to do and to be perfectly sure he can do it. It is very certain that he is one of those rare men who has made few, if any, mistakes. He should thank heaven and be happy. God help the man that crossed Henry Slocum. He would not brook any undue familiarity. One man tried that I know of, court-martialed immediately. He was familiar with the case. He would erupt in terrible temper. He would erupt in a temper tantrum from time to time. He was quiet, pulled back. People said he, and probably was, aloof. Aloofness probably characterized. There was no question about his sharp tongue. He could lash a subordinate, even a private, for inattention to duty, and appear quite haughty in the process. Yet when it suited him, he could be as discreet as a defense counsel. Once, when questioning a rebel prisoner about Wade Hampton, he listened to the rebel portray Hampton as a dandy. "One of those fellows from West Point," the Southerner said. Slocum knew better. He knew Hampton never even seen inside West Point. But he played the rebel's game, bleeding the rebel for more and more intelligence, and remarking with a poker face something to the effect, this is Slocum speaking, "Yeah, that's true about those West Pointers. Some of them, they don't know enough to even straddle a horse." There he was, West Pointer himself to the core. If he disagreed with you, as he did occasionally with his friend Sherman, his friend Howard, Slocum would tell you to your face. He was no gossip. And the Joe Hooker wars notwithstanding, Slocum was a team player. Sherman appreciated that. You could depend upon what Slocum said. You could depend upon him to follow orders. You could depend on Slocum to fight. Wonderful, wonderful Corps Commander and Wing Commander. A few words about his buddy and fellow Wing Commander Oliver O'Hara. Oh, I'm running long. One of his staff officers, Lieutenant Colonel William E. Strong, wrote about being with Howard during the fighting at Bentonville. "I've been riding with General Howard for 5 hours, backwards and forwards, along our skirmisher lines, exposed to a deadly fire. I thought both of us would be killed. I never hesitated yet to go where my duty called me or where ordered, but I do object most seriously to being made a target for the enemy to practice on." Captain Howard, this is Oliver Oates' brother who's on the staff, once said at Ezra Church that riding in battle with a man who's always prepared to die is not as pleasant as one might think. I entirely agree with Captain Howard. Strong also notes that during that particular ride, bullets flying all around, Howard saw a teamster beating a horse unmercifully, cursing a blue streak all the while. Notwithstanding other much more important matters demanding his attention, Howard pulled up his horse and yelled out to the irate teamster, hold on there, my man." This caused the poor fellow holding his lead lines to turn and look up into the general's face. Having thus attracted the driver's attention, Howard continued, "Suppose, just as some of those vile oaths you're issuing from your lips, suppose just at that time one of these passing cannonballs should take your head off." The teamster thought, then hesitatingly replying right back to General Howard, "Well, General, I guess that'd be just my goddamn luck if that Howard shook his head and he rode on. And he said to Strong, ruefully, "I believe that man's beyond redemption." And thus Howard usually is made into a caricature because of his overt Christian beliefs. This was not only true in his own day, but ever since. He makes a tempting target for historians who like to poke fun at someone or who mix their own personal agendas with their writing or teaching. Nobody seems to want to defend Howard as a soldier, and they don't pay much attention to him as an individual. What has attracted attention to Howard recently, however, is the concern he displayed for blacks during the war and his valiant, unselfish work with the Freedmen's Bureau following war. This is all very unfair. Let's listen to Sherman as he writes to Howard in the middle of the war. I cannot deny myself the pleasure it gives me to express to you the deep personal respect I entertain for you. I had known you by reputation, but it needed the opportunity our first short campaign gave me to appreciate one who mingled so gracefully and perfectly the polished Christian gentleman and the prompt, zealous, and gallant soldier. No one that I can recall ever accused Sherman of being a flatterer. The same could be said for Grant's alter ego, John Rawlins. Howard was a Christian soldier and a most excellent man, and was frequently, and not without reason, called Havelock of our army. Havelock, I had to look up and check out, was a British hero during the Sepoy Mutiny in India, a legend in his time. Howard and Hardee were old friends. They served together at West Point. Hardee as commandant, Howard as instructor in mathematics. Howard also helped Professor John D.W. French, who acted as chaplain at the academy, and the young lieutenant actually entertained thoughts of resigning from the army and entering the ministry. Howard would eat dinner at the Hardees frequently and become a real friend and influence over Hardee's 10-year-old son, Willie. And it would be to Howard that Hardee's daughters would turn in those dark days of April 1865 in North Carolina. Willie had just died at the hands of Howard's men at Bentonville, and the Hardee girls asked protection for the family that had nursed him while he died. Howard, of course, helped them gladly. He had tried hard, the record shows, to soften the effect of the Army's march in Georgia and in the Carolinas. Indeed, without this restraint, the example and conviction of Oliver O. Howard, one might ask, how bad might it have been for Southern civilians? Please make no mistake in misjudge Howard. He was a patriot to the core of his being and fought as hard as he knew how to destroy the Confederate Army. Indeed, the only criticism I know that he ever made of Sherman, to whom he was intensely loyal, was at Bentonville when Sherman countermanded his orders and called back his troops and failed to finish off Joe Johnston and Hardee. Soldiers either loved Howard or they made fun of him behind his back. But no one could deny that old prayer book Howard walked as he talked. He reminds me of Leonidas Pope. Of course, Howard was a professional soldier while Pope was not. But the way these two Christians approached the terrible job they had to do was similar. Reluctant killers, both of them, wide open for the gibes of hypocrisy and unseemly soft-heartedness. And I'd like to finish with that group of men you've got at the bottom. I don't think anyone would dream of calling Howard's immediate subordinates John Logan or Frank Blair soft-hearted. These were extremely aggressive corps commanders, as were the other general officers I've chosen to list on your sheets and called the Wolf Pack. Sherman, I think, selected two inner-directed men of courage, two who never sought the limelight for themselves and who never would. He chose these two unusually responsible leaders, Slocum and Howard, to head his two wings, his two armies, if you will. They would serve as a buffer between him and his zealous, sometimes overeager corps and division commanders. Davis, Kilpatrick, Carlin, Maurer, Logan. No one would outdo these five men I've listed here for aggressiveness, and I easily could put a dozen more of Sherman's lieutenants on the list. Whoever chose to get in their way was asking for big trouble. Thank you very much.